Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the Immedis Deep Dive into Analytics webcast. Really appreciate the time you're giving to this, given the hugely challenging times ahead of everybody currently. I'm going to go through a few things initially, just in terms of the overall structure. First thing is we're scheduled for about an hour. We'll possibly run slightly under that, very conscious of people's time. A little bit about myself, first of all. Richard Limpkin is my name. I'm Chief Product Officer with Immedis. At this stage, I'm over 20 years in HR and payroll technology. A lot of that moving around different sectors across everything from defense forces to retail through financial services, but always in relation to HR and payroll tech. I suppose key thing that I focus on in my role is the intersection of people, process, and technology, and really trying to get the best for our customers, leveraging everything they have in the tool set available to them and making sure that's optimized for their business. In terms of the content for today, bear with me. We're going to try and keep it relatively light and move at a reasonable pace. To start off with, I'm going to give an overview of what the Immedis Analytics platform covers. I'm going to go through some of the very basic high-level concepts that relate to analytics, both in relation to the Immedis platform, but also more generally in the field of analytics and how that specifically applies to the payroll world, and even more so to the global payroll environment. I'm going to talk a good bit about securing data and how you gain access to that data within the Immedis platform. And I suppose this is in relation to explicitly getting access to row-level information, but also how your information is constructed, how it's put together, and how things really fit and work in an interrelated way in a complex environment. I'm going to talk about navigation through the system, how to really best use the Immedis application, how to really get the best out of that, and how to, I suppose, be aware of some of the nuances and the ways of moving very quickly through the Immedis Analytics environment. As with all things, there are multiple ways of doing specific actions, and sometimes there are really quick and easy ways of doing that. So being aware of those can be a huge enabler in terms of having a quick and efficient process. And then I suppose the meat of the whole session really is around giving structured guidance and demonstration of the capabilities of the Immedis platform and how that all fits together. So without spending too much longer on that, in terms of at a very high level what the Immedis Analytics platform does and what it is, effectively this is your one central place for viewing all of your payroll information at a global scale. It's really bringing together all the disparate parts of payroll through jurisdictional operations, through different concepts that apply in some legislative environments, not in others, and bringing them into a centralized view of the world in a way that gives you the ability to see everything at once. But without losing the granularity of detail. And really, if you think about that concept, they're at odds with each other. And if they're not done in a structured way, how do you roll everything up into simple universal concepts and at the same time have the granularity that you need to be able to properly manage payroll at a local level? And that's really what the Immedis Analytics platform is there to do, to give you that control and structure in a uniform way and in a way that allows you to operate in a very coherent way across your organization. So really, what is it? It's our own proprietary analytics platform. It's pulling together all of your data at a very granular level. So all of the detailed information, literally down to every element of pay for every person in your organization, for every period, everything you would ever see on a pay slip, but pulling all of that together into a single structured way of managing it. Which is very different to the kind of classic patchwork quilt approach to global payroll that would have been the legacy of this industry, whereby effectively you're getting different structures of data, different structures of gross to nets, depending on the jurisdictions you're operating in. This really eradicates that. The other key component of the Immedis platform is the consolidation of your global reporting in unified currencies. So regardless of the jurisdictional currency you're operating your payroll in, being able to report that at a global scale in one or more currencies depending on your specific needs and reporting requirements. Who is it targeted at is a key thing to consider, and there are different users for this level of information. So very much targeted at payroll specialists and managers, both at a local and a regional scale. It's targeted at people who have a control function within the business, whether that be within the finance function outside of payroll, whether it be in internal audit functions, or even potentially at external audit functions, but also very much targeted at finance professionals outside of payroll in terms of nominal account management, general ledger posting, and really cost control and accounting across the globe. And the beauty of the Immedis Analytics platform is it gives those differing capabilities within the one same platform with different levels of access. So it's really removing the need to share information, to extract information, to push things around. It's giving people direct access that should have access to the source of truth. Why do we do that? Really, the key things are control, applying additional control to the complex payroll operating environment, applying global operating models that can genuinely give businesses efficiency in the way they operate, consistency and visibility in those controls, and evidencing the controls that you're applying at a global scale is fundamentally important. But beyond everything else, it's giving you certainty. It's giving you real-time certainty over what the process is you're managing and what the real output of the payroll process is. In terms of what the Immedis Analytics platform contains, at a very high level, out the box for all our customers, effectively the global visibility dashboard is the first component. That's really the highest level of information, pulling everything together in a single global understanding of the payroll environment across all time domains, across all payrolls you've ever operated in any jurisdiction. But then we start to drill into more information, so getting into the gross to net management capabilities around global gross to nets, around jurisdictional specific gross to nets, and really starting to drill into the in-country detail as we get into that. It's giving you the ability to do earnings analysis, to look at the detailed cost elements underneath. And even though they have radically different functions in each jurisdiction, even though they have different labels, different local languages and dialects, they all ultimately roll into a framework of concepts that are universal, and being able to do your analysis from one jurisdiction to another as per social security costs or pension or 401k contributions on the employer and employee sides, being able to draw all that together coherently without having to really be the expert in every single jurisdiction you're managing is the important part of this. Being able to move into the element analytics piece to really understand what's driving spikes and behaviors in the payroll, and being able to see that trending over a period of time and enhancing that forward-looking control in the operating environment. Then we move on from those kind of very standard concepts within payroll into the more advanced controls around understanding why variances are being driven. And with all the scale of a global payroll, where do you start? Being able to draw your attention and identify outliers through ranked variance analysis, their key components. And these are all things I'll cover in a few minutes to just take you through what that really, really tangibly means and how you would apply it. All the way through managing foreign exchange, managing currency pairs and how they relate to your payroll and how they relate to the consolidation of financial information across regions. Another key component then is moving more slightly away from the payroll area and crossing over into the finance area, the ability at a global or local scale to reconcile your nominal accounting, cost accounting, and the payroll gross to net concepts in a single unified way, being able to understand what's causing variance at a nominal account code level, and actually being able to drill from that top headline level in the organization right down to the underlying components driving it, all the way down to a person in a period in a given jurisdiction. And then finally, crossing over again into things that are increasingly impinging on the global payroll space. Items, the UK would be a good example, global pay equality, gender pay equality, being able to apply those concepts that sometimes start out as being localized concepts and enforced as legislation in one jurisdiction, but typically in global payroll would very quickly become something that becomes a regional requirement, if not a global one. So being able to be ahead of these and apply what is actually just good practice and legally required in some jurisdictions, but being able to apply those universally as an organization as you choose to. So they're all key components of the analytics platform. In terms of some of the basic concepts in navigation, there's some key concepts here that really apply to not just the Midas platform, but analytics concepts generally. These are universal across everything we do in the Midas analytics platform. So these are concepts that you'd be very familiar with from even basic tool sets like Excel. The concept of having a worksheet and having different panes within that worksheet. I suspect everyone's pretty comfortable with those. Moving on from there, we have two key things to consider. There's filters and context. So always understanding the context of the question you're asking. And really what analytics is doing is trying to help you solve questions. It's helping you get to an answer to a question. So understanding the context or the frame in which you're asking the question always helps get to the answer in the quickest way. And make sure that if there are different ways of tackling a problem or a question, you're doing it in the optimum way for that particular question. The content really then is the underlying piece that gets brought to the surface by applying those filters and contexts. And there's a few more concepts that relate to this, but these are all fairly basic concepts in terms of managing information and dealing with data at a mass scale. Dimensions and measures really are the two most fundamental things in data analytics. So your dimensions are very simply, what are the dimensions that you would apply to a piece of information? And these typically are things that you would use as labels. They would be headings on a table, for example. Somebody's age is a dimension. Somebody's name is a dimension. The country in which the payroll resides is a dimension. There's an almost unlimited number of dimensions that can be applied to something, and choosing the right dimensions is absolutely key to getting quick answers and properly structured answers to questions. And then the measures are the underlying things that you want to do something with based on the dimensions. So the simplest measure that you could think of would just be the value of a particular payment to a person. So the measure would be the amount. A dimension might be what it's for, who it's going to, when it was given to them. So these things always go together. Measures and dimensions are always used in conjunction, and really it's the measure that is the answer you're trying to get to. So just thinking on those, the key thing really to get a grip with is that dimensions are generally things that can't be aggregated. They're things that basically headers on tables, even row labels on tables in a simple form would be your dimensions. They're usually used as headings, and they very commonly relate to each other. So there's always hierarchies within a dimension. So simplest example would be a given region in the world has a number of countries in it. They're both dimensions, but one is the parent of the other. Within that country, you may operate many legal entities, another dimension. Within each of those legal entities, you could have a multitude of payrolls. And within each of those payrolls, you'll have a number of pay runs. They're all dimensions and they all interrelate. Sorry, they're all dimensions, but they all interrelate in a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is something that the Midas Analytics platform takes care of for you. You don't need to worry about that component. You just need to figure out which dimension you want to use. Do I want all this summed up by country? Do I want it summed up by currency? Do I want it by period or date? And then the measures are the things typically that you would be able to apply a sum to, whether it's an average value you're looking for, a sum, a rolling variance. They're all things that you can apply to a measure given that you know the dimension you want to use. Now, these might sound slightly complex, but really they're just the wrappers that you give to information to make it easy to use. And you'd rarely be talking about them in a theoretical way. You would simply be just talking about the fields that you want to pull into the equivalent of a pivot table. In terms of access and security to data, before we get into real detail, it's probably really important to understand that data is secured at a row level. Now, what does that specifically mean? It means that every single element of pay to every individual person, broken right down to the nth degree of detail, has a security layer uniquely applied to it. So the granularity of the data is at the very bottom level. It means that we can securely carve up the information relating to a single person in a multitude of ways. And every single user of the Midas Analytics platform is inheriting their security settings from the wider application. So just by granting somebody in the Midas platform access to the right payrolls, they will inherit the analytics visibility of those same people within those same payrolls. And all the data is secured in that same way. So securing your analytics data is actually not something you need to worry about or manage separately. It's inherited from just using the platform itself. it means that there's hugely fine-grained control over who can see what. And a good example of that would be that the visibility you may give to somebody operating a payroll right down to every component of pay for the individual person could be fundamentally different to the access you might grant to somebody in an internal audit role who actually may not be privileged enough to see the payments to the individuals, but can actually see the mass sum total for a given payroll or country by period. So that's all stuff that's quite normal in analytics to be able to carve information up to different levels, but the same security model always applies and cannot be bypassed. In terms of the things to really think about in that aspect of data, singular system access is important. So you're not having to separately secure and manage data in a data warehouse. It's all completely self-contained within the Immedis platform, and the security model is inherited. So whatever security we apply, whether that's single sign-on with multi-factor authentication, the same applies to the analytics platform. It's a component of the Immedis platform. The embedded row-level security is physically impossible to bypass. The only way that can be bypassed is to deliberately extract and export information from the platform, save it to Excel and share it. But even that can be disabled in the platform and only privileged users have access to it. So it means that your data is absolutely locked in and locked down, and only the appropriate people can get access to it, which then again is underpinned by other module components such as the user attestation. So you can see exactly who has access, why they have access, and when somebody last said it was okay for them to have that access, right down to individual level and controlled by group. The data is real time, which is fundamentally different to most global payroll platforms. Immedis is data first platform, which means everything from the integrated data into the environment right through to the result sets are managed at a cell level within the Immedis platform. The analytics are not something that are produced after the fact. They're produced in line with the payroll as a result of operating the payroll. So it's not something you get as something to look at later on. It's something you actually use to review, approve, and sign off your payroll. And that's a key component of it, is having that access at the right point in time. Then the final piece is around the access itself, that it is granular. It's right down to individual components for all people, for all periods, for all elements of pay. So any payrolls that we've managed for our customers are accessible through the Immedis platform. There are settings within the platform, and I'll show those to you in a moment, which predefine how much data is pulled back. So if we have 7 years of history beyond which data is purged, you don't necessarily automatically want to see all 7 years every time you run a query. You're more likely to have a query on your data about a more recent period. So having those default settings to bring the most recent back first and then fetch more if you ask for it is just about having an optimized approach to how you manage your data. Okay, so the next piece is to get hands-on with the platform. So bear with me as I share my other screen. So what you're seeing in front of you is the Immedis platform, and within that, the analytics module. So dropping initially into the main control dashboard on the Immedis platform, this is giving you visibility, and I'm conscious there may be a bit of a delay in the screen from what I'm showing to what you're seeing. So I'll just pause from time to time for the screen to catch up. So I'm talking to what's on the screen. What you're seeing here is the global consolidation of a very simplified payroll. The data that's been put into this training environment is deliberately simplified down to a small number of jurisdictions with a single payroll in each jurisdiction to keep things simple and to be able to explain through the data. What you're seeing is your entire payroll consolidated down into a single unified reporting currency. And that currency is defined by you, the customer. Whether that be consolidated into any of the major currencies, typically we would support USD, sterling, euro, Japanese yen as the consolidation currencies. And obviously each of the independent payrolls is operated in the local currency applicable in that country. Everything consolidated down at a global scale, which means you are truly comparing apples with apples. And that's a really important part of a concept I mentioned earlier, context, always understanding the context of the data you're looking at. So in this situation, my context is really quite broad. The only context I've really applied is the currency. I've just said, I want to see everything in USD in this scenario. I've opened this up to all countries, and you see the filters on the left-hand side for all countries. for all pay groups within those countries for all periods of time. I haven't put any constraints on that yet, but I can very quickly apply those constraints, and it doesn't have to be through the filters. And this is about understanding what's feasible and how to do things quickly. If I want to filter down to a single country, it's very much a clickable concept that you click through, and the filters compound each other as you work through that. So if I want to filter down to a certain country, I can do that very quickly, and I can see joiners and leavers in that jurisdiction for a particular period. If I want to filter again to that period specifically, now I'm looking at Italy for July 2018, and all of my sum totals have narrowed down to that. And just being aware, you'll see on the left-hand side as well, my filters have navigated themselves to those same contextual items. So it's not possible for me as a user to get these wrong, to get conflicting constraints, because every filter is related to every other filter. If I make a choice in one, it narrows my choices in others, and it doesn't matter which order I do that in. Everything is contextual. If I want to come back out again, I simply unfilter, and I move myself back up the tree to look at other things. So really, the best way of thinking about the context within analytics is think of trees and branches. And if you start a journey down one branch and you decide you want to be on another branch, you come back to the trunk and you go back out on another branch. And that's just the key thing. Once you think of that, you won't get lost, and you don't get lost in the data. You can keep coming back out and keep going in until your heart's content, and ultimately until you answer the question that you're trying to answer. Now, what quite often happens in this type of environment, when you have this level of access to a lot of information, the question that you initially try to answer doesn't always end up being the most important thing you find. Those trails, those breadcrumb trails of data, lead you down a path of really visual storytelling with the information and understanding things that you didn't even see coming. And that's really the most powerful part of analytics, is that it identifies outliers that would have otherwise been hidden in a mound of data. They would have been so obscured by the volume of data you're dealing with. But in the visual storytelling component of that, they're brought to the surface and they become obvious. And people generally are visual. Human beings are trained to behave in a visual way. Our brains work that way. And that's why analytics really resonates with people who understand data, but it resonates with everybody in terms of being able to visually see things. So I'm going to move on down into more detail from here. I'm going to move from the top level of the dashboard into more detailed gross to net components. So I'm now moving down into structured data at a more granular level, and really applying basic accounting concepts. And simplifying global payroll can be achieved. And the best way I find to think of that is simply following the money. It is that simple. Money in a payroll environment on a gross to net has to travel from somewhere to somewhere. It travels from an employer to third parties or the employee. And when the employee gets the money, they do something with it. They either pay it back to the employer on a loan repayment, they pay it to a third party in terms of tax and social deductions, pension, and other components, or they keep some of it. And payroll really is as simple as that. There are phenomenal complexities underneath that deliver the values in each of those cells. But in terms of actually understanding the flow of the money, the flow of the accounting concepts, and this really relates to general ledgers as well, it can be kept that simple. And what the Immedius platform does is it simplifies payrolls down to that level. And what you're seeing on the screen in what we call the harmonized gross to net is the lowest level of detail with which you can still look at every country at once. If you go below this level of detail, things start to get quite specific to a regional jurisdiction, and I'll show that in a minute. But at this level, you're really seeing a unified view of the world. And again, it can be in local currency, it can be normalized back to USD. In terms of, again, understanding your context, initially pulling back the last 2 years of most recent information, so your current year plus the previous year. But being able to, at the click of a button, flick that to all data for all time, up to the statutory limits of data purging. All of that completely self-managed by the platform, not something you as the customer need to worry about. But again, your contexts are always the same. And that's a really important part of making this an easy journey for the customer, is making sure that whatever you're trying to do, whatever question you're trying to get to, the left-hand side is the control pane. And that's really where you should always see the same concepts, that whether it's country context you're trying to get into, or whether it's right down into specific run types, off-cycle calculations, bonus runs, they're all completely segregatable within this. What you then get into, the next stage is getting into the hierarchy of information. And this is where you can start to drill to answer those questions. Rather than looking at the top level, drill down a level. So from an individual person in a country down to the individual periods, the individual payroll cycles that person was processed on, and being able to easily drill up and down, again, to get the period by period figures for each individual component of pay. And I'm going to briefly drill even further beyond that. I'm going to drill into the underlying components that make up, and this will take some time, the underlying components that make up that payroll, drilling into a specific payroll. So apply a filter, and then I'll see individual people, and I'll see them for each period, and I'll still see them within the harmonized gross to net, but now I'm seeing the actual detailed payroll elements that relate specifically to that country. And I've done that without having to change too many contexts. I've done that within the same framework, and I haven't lost the ability to see the top level right down to the bottom. Now, this is where there is a real transition point between what's truly global and what gets to be local. And some of these local concepts don't apply to all jurisdictions, which is why the immediate data management framework takes care of that for the user. So moving on from there, I'm going to move into, again, more detailed analysis, moving into individual components of pay. So by period, again, being able to drill. So I'm seeing my unified view. I'm seeing these local components. Currency is always at play, as you would expect in global payroll. Regionalized components by individual payrolls, by currency, into components of pay groupings, and then down a level into individual people that make up those components of pay groupings and the periods in which they were paid. So the ability to drill and drill up and down as required. So that's just the ability to analyze what makes up components of the payroll, what's driving underlying costs that you might be seeing, and how do you best manage those. In terms of moving to the next component, we'll move into pay element analysis. So this really is the key aspect of the immediate analytics platform that ties together those top level components and the underlying drivers in a given jurisdiction. So as a simple example here, I might focus in on a certain country. We look at, take a Spanish payroll. The data that you're seeing is manufactured data. So it's obfuscated, it doesn't have any meaning, but it still should give us enough to work with in terms of seeing this. There's a key concept which we apply to the analytics platform within Immedis, which is inclusions and exclusions. So rather than having to explicitly include every last thing that you want to see, it's made as simple as saying, I want to see all of my gross pay, unless it's something I don't want to see at a more detailed level. So I'm going to take out a bonus here. And in fact, let's take out all bonus components and see that that unskews the data. And that's that done. So now I've recut the data. I've taken out bonus, which is very much periodic. And now I've got a much flatter curve in the payroll costs. And I'm able to analyze that in more detail. But I can also drill through from wherever I'm looking, and I can start to drill into the components that are making up the biggest piece of this. So I can filter, I can search, I can drill into the detail of the data. You'll notice as well that the specific components of pay are in local language. All components of pay within the Immedis platform are available in both local and global language, and the framework applies equally to all of that. So you have the choice at all times how you want to operate and how you want to visualize the data. But again, it's really trying to give you the visual capability of drilling from the top and finding the underlying causes, but also being able to look forwards as to if there's a trend, how do I impact that trend? How do I have a positive influence on it? And how do I make recommendations based on what's gone before and what's likely to reoccur, or the data is telling me definitely will reoccur? So from there, I'm going to move on now into some more of the controls around potentially GL variance as a component to look at a global scale from a finance perspective. And this is applying one more concept to layer on top. So again, everything on the left-hand side, very similarly constructed. The only inclusion here that you haven't seen before is the inclusion of the debit credit construct, the nominal accounting codes that are really pulling together the GL view of the world versus the gross to net view of the world. And what this is allowing you to do is look at your entire global accounting estate, which includes payroll, and being able to look at that at the very top debit credit level, assuming that there's a global chart of accounts at play, and then being able to drill through that and understand what's causing something to happen. So if I'm seeing what's known as a rolling variance from one period to the next, something is changing, basic counting standards apply. If it's a number that has increased, it's green. You could argue that potentially some of these increasing is not always a good thing, but basic accounting standards applied, red, things have decreased from one period to the next, and where there's very little change, less than 2% as this is currently set, there's no color variance at all. So again, it's visual. If something's red or something's green, I need to look at it. If it's not changed, there's nothing really going on. So I can now drill through that from the top level accounts into the country that triggered it, into the payroll that's underneath that, and in this case, most of them are one-to-one. Drilling again then further into the elements underneath that payroll that contributed to that nominal account. So I'm starting to see some things haven't varied, some things have, and then going a level again further and seeing the specific items at a detailed level within those groupings that are causing the changes and causing those triggered changes, rightly or wrongly. So you'll see some of the data is very consistent. 250s moving across, there's a drop that stays sustained, drops further. And these aren't necessarily giving you the full answer as to what caused that, but it's giving you an exact finger point at the very time something happened, right down to what caused it. And then going a step further, we would actually get down to individual data level now as to which person's payment triggered that. So now we can see for the employee social security, actually the changes are completely consistent across everybody apart from one outlier in Benjamin Harmon. So that's where I should start looking. And what caused that? I don't know without looking at the inputs of the payroll and going a step further, but I now know the person in the payroll in the entire global estate that has triggered that variance. And I got there in roughly 2 minutes. So that's the GL variance component, and that's become a very powerful tool across the board. The next piece to look at then is ranked variance. And again, using the power of analytics and trying to move the dial in payroll operations from show me everything and I'll spend a long time finding out what's wrong with it, to let me try and help you understand where to start looking. And in this case, this is ranking variances from highest to lowest, positive or negative, in terms of things that are impacting one payroll to another. This gives you the ability to compare any period to any other period. In this case, it's automatically defaulting to most recent payroll versus the last most recent payroll. It could be the same period in 2 years. It could be seasonally inclined. You could look at quarter end payrolls or full quarters, entirely depending on the context of the payroll. Could be down to weekly or fortnightly payrolls as well. Again, same concepts apply. What am I interested in? Well, in this case, I'm interested in the gross pay. And what do I want to exclude? Well, again, I could start to exclude things that are skewing the bonus amounts or skewing the total amounts because they're seasonal. Before I do that, if I take a look at what's causing this, what's causing Benjamin Hendricks to have a variance, well, if I click through, I'm seeing that there's a bonus. Okay, so that's clearly going to have an impact on the variance. It's clearly going to have an impact on gross pay. I can't tell from here, from a pure payroll context, whether that bonus is right or wrong. Should that bonus have been for somebody else? Did it get passed through this vary? What I'm then going to do is move down into excluding those items. And I'll take out things that are clearly going to cause a variance. And now I'm down to having removed the bonuses, and let's have a look at what's left. So I'm starting to eradicate decisions that would have a problem. Other taxable income. Again, what is that? We'd need to look potentially at the inputs into the payroll to understand what had driven that, but I'm finding the root cause of the variances and I'm understanding whether they're relevant and whether they're at a scale I should be concerned about. So again, the whole point of this is moving the dial from looking at everything to being focused, looking at what's not right. And then beyond there, I'm going to move from my ranked variants into components that are kind of crossing over from payroll space, but invariably payroll have a function in trying to help the business understand these. So as I move over into firstly the FX components, quite often managed by the finance team, where we're managing the global estate of payroll, who sets the corporate FX rate? Is that set by treasury function? Is it set by corporate accounting? Typically, the currency pairs are set on a monthly basis, and this is just illustrating where they haven't yet been set and provided, which means the backstop position for consolidation is going to be the prevailing rate at the time of those payrolls. So it's just giving you that level of control across what you're doing. The last piece I'm going to move towards is things that cross over slightly into the HR space, but again, payroll have a role in trying to answer some of these questions. So the components here would be around average gross pay by age and being able to drill into that and understand what's driving that at a global scale. And again, you can only do this if you're normalizing your information back to a single currency. You can only drive this type of information if you're comparing apples with apples. I mentioned it earlier, things like gender pay equality in the UK are becoming standard requirements more globally now. So being able to service and solution those with a single solution, this is really where the intersection with the HR world comes into play, and good sound integration with prevailing HCM providers, integration of things as simple concepts like having somebody's gender stored. It may not be required for the absolute calculation of payroll in most cases, but if there's a statutory requirement to deliver gender pay equality reporting, then it is required. And being able to drive that and get the right answers and being able to cut the data as you need to immediate answers. So that's the last component I'm going to cover on the, I suppose, whistle-stop tour of the immediate analytics component. I'm going to move now towards Q&A, so bear with me as I do that. I'm going to be looking to try and gather up some of the questions, so please do start to ping them in as they come. And we'll just give a couple of minutes there for people to submit questions if there are any. Okay, first question in. How does the hierarchy relate between the different data elements? So I think what that means is, and hopefully I'll answer this correctly, the components you're seeing on the left-hand side, they're all intertwined with each other. So the Immedis Analytics platform itself understands how the pay groups link to the countries, how the tax years link to the periods, which payrolls have been operated in which tax years. All of those different components link together, and the linking of those is already built into the analytics platform. So as a user, you're able to then filter as and how you want to without needing to know that I go to one filter before the other. And without having to do anything to really pull those in different levels. That gives you the ability then to just operate really in any order. And that's probably the most key component in answering questions with data analytics, is being able to not be sure of the path you need to go on, but still get to the right answer. And really that means that there's a number of different paths you can go down, but still get to the same result. Okay, next question. Yeah, currency consolidation has come through as a question. So that is a good question. It's a slightly complicated one. How do we manage the consolidation of currency? So what I might do for that is move back to the top level dashboard. So just for context, and I'll reshare screen. So at my top level dashboard, what's happening here effectively is every single payroll is locked to a currency of operation. And that's, generally speaking, it's the currency of that country, but that's not true in all cases. There are a few exceptions to that, which means that all the calculations, every last breakout of every piece of pay in that payroll is operated in that local currency. Now, there's effectively what we refer to as a foreign exchange hierarchy in the platform, which is taking different exchange rates in order of preference. And the order of preference is payment transaction first. So if we execute the payments, the foreign exchange rate that's used is the payment from the source currency, the payment to currency at the rate the payment was made. So it's a given fact. It happened. We know what it is, and it's locked into the platform. So that's taken first. If that's not the case, and if that hasn't been executed or isn't required, then the next place we look is for your corporate reporting rates. And if you've set those through the platform, through the portal on a potentially month-by-month basis, we look for those next. And if they're not found or haven't been set, then the backstop rate position is the one that we would get from the prevailing market rate for that FX, the interbank rate, retrieved through web services from global sources. So there's no situation in which we don't have an FX rate, but the FX rate applied will always be an order of preference for your organization. Okay, a couple more questions coming in here, bear with me. Downloading, yeah, very good question. So how do you download information? And hopefully I have the privileges to do this. So bear with me, I'll find something that's useful to download first of all. I'll probably go to Gross to Net, might be a good place to start. In terms of downloading information, I'm hoping you can see at the bottom right of the screen, there is a download icon. Again, the most important thing here is understand your context. So there are different panes on this dashboard, and those different panes contain different information. Each of these little spark lines is a pane. The main content itself is a pane, and the left-hand control box is an independent pane in itself. So the first thing you do is you identify the context of the data you want to download. So if I want the main data in here, I'm going to select that so that I'm in the right context. And now I'm going to click download. And I'm hoping this is popping up on your screen, so I'll just describe this if in case it isn't. I get the pop-up box if I have the privilege to do that, and that is access controlled. And I've got a series of choices now. I can download the image if I'm putting this into a presentation, which is really, from an advice point of view, that's the optimum way of achieving this, because data security is only controllable by the Midas platform when the data is in the platform. So if you are a privileged user and you do extract information, we have no control over where that Excel document is now sent or goes. You may well have controls in your own IT infrastructure as to what data can be sent through data loss prevention and other concepts, but if they're not in place, it can be potentially a dangerous thing to download this. Then there's two other key components that are quite useful in this. The data itself is the next option, which is the raw underlying information, and that would be quite a lot of information. And then the final piece is the crosstab, which effectively is saying, give me the information in the very same structure and format it is on the screen already. Whereas downloading the data is giving you every individual data point, which you would then use in, typically in Excel. You might use it then to drive that into a pivot table and do your own analysis. So you'll see here I've got the ability on the screen now to download either, typically I'll get the first 200 transactions, because there could be several million transactions for a single pay period for all payrolls for one client, or I download all rows as a text file. Effectively that's downloading a CSV document for me, which I import into Excel. So I won't do that because that'll be a lot of data. Okay, I'm going to go on to next question now. So a question here from Brooke, are you able to create custom analytic views per security group? Short answer is yes. So the menu options that are available here are completely custom down to the individual user or group. So what you're seeing on the screen here as existing customers will not be the very same that you see yourselves. Your own menus are tailored down to the specific configuration that was done during the onboarding stage of the project, as well as potentially you will have other custom views that have been incorporated for specific use cases that are not used by everybody or not in the standard suite. What's shown on the screen here is very much the standard suite. So if there are specific analytic views that have a unique function or are solving potentially a question that needs to be resolved on a consistent basis, so an example of that might be an internal audit function needing to be able to see the quarterly salary only, base salary only, no other things, but without the person details, so they can only see that at a country or a payroll level across all payrolls, then that would be published in a menu item here, where the ability to filter and drill down to the person level doesn't exist. So that's then provided to them as users. They can log in and they can execute that in real time whenever they need to. The data will always be up to date. It will always have all periods in that, and they can decide which periods they want, but it's impossible for them to go any further down to the individual people or to anything that isn't base salary only. So the data effectively, to all intents and purposes at that point, is anonymized. I suppose the key thing to be aware of with that is there is always a risk if you're, for example, doing reporting at departmental level and there's only one person in that department, then you can start to work backwards to reverse engineer the data and understand what that person earns. So always be very mindful as to who it is that's asking for access to the data, and that you are protecting the data by design as well as by construct within the platform. Okay, I've got another question there. Bear with me one second. Actually, this actually relates very closely. Question from Michael: would you, in terms of advice, would you allow other business functions to have access? Very much yes, but always be mindful. As I said, always be mindful in what access they should have, what level of granularity you're prepared to give them, or they from an authority point of view should have, and just configure that in a way that it's least data privileges first. The advantage of doing that effectively is that everybody is operating from a single source of truth. What you're not having to do as a payroll function is extract data, construct data, manipulate and manufacture that in a format to feed somebody. You're actually giving that user access directly to help themselves effectively and pardon the expression, but teach a man to fish. That's really what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to enable those other functions in the business to have their data questions and problems solved by you, but in a way that you're not having to constantly facilitate that. So it's a very powerful thing to do. As I said, particularly for internal audit, can be a very powerful thing to do. For finance functions much wider than payroll, it can be incredibly useful, particularly around the nominal account reconciliation down to gross to net. But again, cutting that off at a point at which it transitions into an individual person, allowing them access just down to the payroll or the cycle itself, but not down to the individual that drives the cost within that if required. Great. I think that comes to the end of the questions, unless I just give it another 30 seconds in case any more pop in. Yeah, there we go. Okay, Michael. Security profiles and how configurable they are. The profiles, in terms of full clarity on how the profiles work, think of them in two dimensions. The first dimension is the data access itself, and that's right down to an individual payroll level. Once you have access to the payroll, the question then is how much data within that payroll you can access and what type of data. That's controlled by the analytic view itself. A single analytic view can be exposed to as little as one person, one distinct user. That one person is put into the group that has access to that one view. They're the only person who can see it. And then the data they can access and see is controlled down to the construction of the view itself, and not allowing that user to have authoring privileges. So they can't edit the way the view behaves, they can't change the construct, but they may be able to apply certain filters or be able to apply drills down to a certain level but no further. And that's really, that's down to a concept in terms of data protection, just by design. How much data should they have? What's the lowest level of information they're allowed, while still being able to answer the question that they're asking in the first place. So that's really very tailorable right down to the individual use case. And again, it's really about repeatability. If you're trying to answer something that is part of a comp and ben question that would frequently come from a HR area, again, if there's something you can construct or design that allows them to answer their own question, if it's a recurring thing, even if it relates to sometimes pensions, sometimes something else, that can be done in a unified way, so they have one way of servicing all of those asks. And again, you've given them the solution, but you haven't had to answer the question every time they ask it. Okay, give another 30 seconds or so, and then we're at the end of the questions, I believe. we've gone through all of those. Yeah, great. Okay, well, thanks everybody for your time. I really appreciate it. As I said, we'll try and end slightly early, so we're closing out now. If there are any subsequent questions or if there's any follow-up, we're obviously very happy to take that. Please do pass that in through the same channels. Appreciate your attention and wish you all the very best for the coming weekend. Thanks very much.